I'm Professor Barbara Sahakian, and I'm going to talk to you today about my book, co-authored with Julia Gottwald, called The Mind Reading Machine: How fMRI Reveals What Really Goes On in Our Minds. And one reason for writing this book was my interest in neuroethics. And neuroethics is the study of the ethical, legal, and social questions that arise when scientific findings about the brain are carried into medical practice, legal interpretations, and health and social policy. And I'm a founder member and past president of the International Neuroethics Society, and I hope that all of you who are interested in neuroethics will come and join the society. fMRI brain scans. What is fMRI? Well, functional magnetic resonance imaging indirectly measures neuronal activity by measuring blood flow to specific brain regions being used during the performance of cognitive tasks. So if we're lying in the scanner and we're planning and problem solving, we know that we use our frontal lobes in order to carry out those cognitive processes, and we will get blood flow to that region. And we're going to discuss the ethics of neuroimaging. And there's a growing public perception of neuroimaging as a very hard science, because you see these lovely pictures and they look as though they might be. Some people interpret them as facts. But technology should be applied cautiously. Neuroimaging is not evidence for causation. And we'll discuss a number of the hot topics in neuroimaging and think about studies that were done in neuroimaging in healthy volunteers, including reading intentions, unconscious racial biases, empathy biases for members of the in-group over the out-group, deception and lie detection, neurocorrelates of morality, and then we'll move on to forensic neuroimaging, and we'll look at psychopaths. And finally, we'll get to neuromarketing. Well, first, let's discuss measuring hidden racial biases with the help of neuroimaging. So there are two kinds of biases, and we can have explicit racial biases, and most of you are familiar with those. That's a traditional bias where somebody might be biased against a race, for instance, against Black people. And that can be measured using the modern racism scale. And in that scale, you'd be asked whether you strongly agree with statements such as discrimination against Blacks is no longer a problem in the United States, and if you strongly disagree with statements such as it is easy to understand the anger of Black people in America. And if you strongly agree with the first statement and strongly disagree with the second, you come out with a higher racism score. Now, it's been seen that some people can actually trick their answers on those scales because it's fairly straightforward what's being asked. So people have begun to look at implicit racial biases. And those are biases that we're actually unaware of. And we may not want to have biases, but sometimes we're not aware that we have them. And you can actually test your own implicit racial bias by going to the implicit scale there that's given on the website. So how do we measure implicit racial bias? Well, if you're faster to associate positive words such as wonderful with the white good category as compared with the Black good category, then you come out with a higher racial bias score. People such as Liz Phelps have put subjects in the scanner where they viewed Black and white faces while lying in the scanner, and they've seen activation of the amygdala, which was measured. And we know that the amygdala is an area of the brain that's involved in emotional regulation and also in fear. And they also had people complete tests of implicit racial bias and explicit racial bias. And what their results showed was that there was a significant correlation of the amygdala activation with the implicit racial bias, but no correlation with the amygdala activation and explicit racial bias. And that's because the implicit racial bias cannot be tricked or fooled, whereas people can answer as they wish to the explicit racial bias. So you can see the correlations in this slide here. Well, what would we do if we found that people had implicit racial biases? Would it be ethical to screen job applicants, judges, lawyers, teachers, doctors for discriminatory biases? How do we use this information? And there's a related study which looks at in-groups in comparison to out-groups in response to looking at painful stimulations. And what they found was that painful stimulations applied to racial in-group faces induced increased activations in the anterior cingulate cortex and inferior frontal insular cortex in both Caucasians and Chinese. And that the empathetic neuroresponse in the anterior cingulate cortex decreased significantly when participants viewed faces of other races. Well, is there anything that we can do about this to change it? Can we get rid of these biases? And this is what this study was about, because they found that greater interaction with those members from the out-group makes them more like a member of the in-group. And so they looked at Chinese adults who were brought up in Western countries. And in that study, they found that viewing painful stimulations increased activations in the anterior cingulate cortex and inferior frontal insular cortex in both Caucasians and Asians, and that the empathetic neuroresponse in the anterior cingulate cortex did not differ when participants viewed faces of other races. So becoming more familiar with members of the out-group can make them feel more like members of the in-group. Well, let's now consider deception. Does telling a lie activate different areas compared to telling the truth? And in this study by Ganis, they looked at real scenarios where they asked people about their most memorable work experience or most memorable vacation. And in some conditions, they were told to tell the truth. In other conditions, they were asked to come up with a spontaneous lie. And then in still other conditions, they were asked to generate a memorized scenario. So they were given a lie and asked to generate that. Well, does telling a lie activate different areas compared to telling the truth? And indeed it does. So lies elicit increased activation in anterior prefrontal cortex, parahippocampus, precuneus, and the cerebellum. And also, all three of these conditions are slightly different. So telling a spontaneous lie is slightly different from telling a memorized scenario, a planned lie. And when you think about it, we know from other studies that telling the truth is actually the first thing that's generated and the easiest thing to do. In order to tell a spontaneous lie, you actually have to first inhibit the truth and then tell the spontaneous lie. So you get activation in the prefrontal cortex when you're inhibiting the truth. Well, can we and should we use fMRI as a lie detector? And what about false memories? Many of us will have been told stories about ourselves when we were very small children. We don't remember these stories, but after we've been told them, say, by our relatives over and over again, we begin to almost incorporate them as our memories, but they're not really memories. When they first started using fMRI data to test lie detection, they found that they were about 76 to 77% accurate. That was only just a bit better than a polygraph. However, now the models using fMRI data and machine learning are able to achieve 88 to 89% accuracy. So it won't be much longer before they're getting up around 100% accuracy. Well, we'll now go on to think about morality and neuroimaging. And we'll talk about first the moral dilemma, the famous one called the trolley problem. And many of you might already be familiar with this problem. It's very well used. And what you can see in picture one is that there's 5 people on the track and there's a trolley or a train coming down the tracks. And it's about to hit these 5 people. Now you're up there with the switch and you can flick the switch and have the train or trolley move on to the other track, which has only 1 person on it. So you can actually save 5 lives, but at the expense of 1 life. And when you ask people, are you willing to do that? Most people will say yes, because they feel that flicking that switch in order to save people is a good idea. Now we have scenario 2. And here we have 5 people on the track and a trolley or train coming down the track, and it's about to hit these 5 people. Now you're on the bridge with this other person, and you can actually shove them onto the rail, and that will stop the trolley. So then you're asked, would you do that action? Would you push them onto the rail to save those 5 lives? Now in that condition, most people will say no, because of the act of pushing is just too much. When you think about it rationally, you're still saving 5 lives at the expense of 1. But here you have to actually do a very different kind of action. And there's other ways that we can look at morality. So we can put people in a scanner and have them look at these pictures. Both these pictures are very unpleasant, as you can see, but one has a moral connotation with them because one of the picture has a man holding a woman with a knife up to her throat, whereas the other very unpleasant picture has no moral connotation. It's just a very scary big dog with huge teeth. We know quite a lot about the neurocorrelates of morality, and it involves a network which includes the temporoparietal junction and, very importantly, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Well, what if your brain scan does not show this pattern of activation to moral pictures? And that's precisely what Herensky and colleagues found. They looked at offenders who were psychopaths compared to offenders who were non-psychopaths. And they found that the offenders who were non-psychopaths, they had very much more activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex for moral than for non-moral stimuli. However, in psychopaths, there was no difference between the moral pictures and the non-moral pictures, as you can see here. Well, what should we do? Should we diagnose psychopathy with a brain scan? If you show an abnormal activation pattern, should we incarcerate you before you commit a crime? We know that we have some control over our behavior. Well, we'll move on now to neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience. It's a growing area, using neuroscience to predict market success. And this sort of neuroscience can be used to produce an idea for a product, to evaluate a finished product, or for evaluating market strategy. And there's a study here by Kuhn, which looked at it in terms of market strategy. And they had these 6 different advertisements for chocolate bars. And they wanted to know which one of these 6 advertisements would sell the most chocolate bars. So first they had them rated by people as to which one they liked the best and thought would sell the most chocolate bars. And then they also had 18 women in a scanner, and they viewed these pictures one by one, and they looked at the activations in the brain. And then afterwards, very cleverly, they put these pictures up one by one and saw how many chocolate bars were actually bought by the shoppers. So that was the actual sales. So the one at the top got the most sales and the second one got the second most sales. But by interview, we got a very different picture. So the interview wasn't really very strongly related to what the actual sales were. In contrast, the fMRI predictions were very similar to what the actual sales were. And the activations tended to be in the reward systems in the brain, areas such as the nucleus accumbens and medial orbital frontal cortex. Well, companies want to make money from neuroimaging, and there are several companies now that do lie detection. And there's also consultancy firms that want to look into neuromarketing. Well, what are the practical limitations and ethical implications? And can an expert really read your mind? And this was a very interesting experiment that Adrian Owen did. And basically, he was lying in a scanner and he was doing something, and he took these images of his own brain, and then he sent them to the world's top 10 mirror images. And he asked them, what am I doing while lying in the scanner? And you can see here that there's 10 answers, and very few of them have any overlap at all. And actually, they couldn't guess what he was doing. He was telling a lie. So even the world's top 10 mirror images can't read your mind with no context. Now, this is a very futuristic experiment by Jack Gallant, and it has to do with whether they can reconstruct what people are looking at using fMRI in computational models. And what they did was they had participants watch a set of film trailers known to the computer while in the scanner. And it was therefore possible to associate the trailers with the brain activation patterns. And after this training, the participants then watched a second set of new film clips. But this time the computer had no information about the content of the film trailers. Instead, the model used the known associations to form a reconstruction of the clips. And in this slide, you can see in the top row what they were really looking at, the new film clips. And then in the bottom, you can see what was reconstructed. And of course, they're very hazy and they're not perfect, but still it's quite exciting that you could even get this far with this type of technique. And one can imagine that if you keep performing these types of studies, you'll get to a very good picture of what people are actually looking at and be able to reconstruct it. So this study now by John Dylan Hines and colleagues is on reading hidden intentions. And they were able to decode which intention, that's addition or subtraction, the subject was covertly maintaining from the activation pattern of the medial prefrontal cortex. So people were lying in a scanner, and then they got two numbers that they looked at, and they had a chance to decide whether they were going to add them or subtract them. And it turned out that with time, they could actually decode which intention was going to happen. So they could add these two numbers, it would have ended up with 89, or subtract them and ended up with 23, and they have the response that they can make. But it could be determined in advance which of these they were going to do. And that was a very exciting time because it did bring people to start to think about the neuroethics of this, that we could maybe read people's hidden intention before they act. So what are the limitations of fMRI? Well, at present, most studies are group studies rather than individual-based studies. Also, we have individual differences in our brains. Scans have to be interpreted within a context. And despite the striking images, the data must be interpreted in a critical fashion and not simply accepted as visual proof. So these studies are just snapshots and do not take into account your ability to determine your actions. Well, some ethical questions in neuroimaging are given here, and I'm sure you have some of your own questions too. But should we attempt to predict behavior? What impact will this have on our legal system? And what is the risk-benefit ratio to individuals and society of using available neurotechnology? How should we address error of measurement? Who should have access to this neurotechnology? And what about incidental findings or privacy or fears that neurotechnology could be used for corporate manipulation of consumers? So in summary, neuroscientists cannot read your mind. However, fMRI studies can be used in certain circumstances to provide information about the self that is unobtainable by other means. So for example, there's this groundbreaking science paper which has shown that we can detect conscious awareness in a patient who fulfills all of the criteria for the vegetative state, when existing clinical techniques were unable to provide that information. A 23-year-old patient suffered severe brain injury in a traffic accident and was in a vegetative state with no evidence of conscious awareness. The researchers put this patient in the scanner and asked them to imagine playing tennis. And while this patient was imagining playing tennis, they observed supplementary motor area activity. And that was the same area of the brain where healthy controls activated when imagining playing tennis. And the researchers also detected parahippocampal gyrus, posterior parietal lobe, and lateral premotor cortex activity while the patient imagined walking around their house. And this again was the same area that volunteers activated while imagining moving around their house. So I'll finish off with a sort of fun study that was done where they had people lie in a scanner and look at pictures of their person that they loved. And one can imagine that we could remove the mystery from love. So will it come a time when you lie in the scanner and you'll be looking at the person you're about to marry, and they'll want to see, do you show this romantic love which activates the ventral tegmental area and caudate nucleus, these areas that are involved in reward and motivation, or do you not show that? And maybe we'll ask people to do this before they decide to get married. So final conclusion, this new technology in machine learning will be very helpful for understanding the healthy brain and for diagnosis and treatment of people with neuropsychiatric disorders and brain injury. However, discussion is needed between the public and scientists, ethicists and policymakers to address the ethical issues raised. And I want to give a special thank you to Professor Fong, Professor Fu, and Professor Crystal for reading my book and for making comments on it. And also, I want to point out that these exciting studies are currently going on at the Institute of Science and Technology for Brain-Inspired Intelligence. So those people who are interested in the area of neuroimaging can get involved with this group. And I finally want to thank my colleague, Dr. Chon Luau, for inviting me to give this lecture. Thank you.